The map of the world is being quietly redrawn, and most Americans have no idea it's happening right now, right above their border and right across the Atlantic. What you are about to hear is not speculation, not conspiracy, not the noise of political theater. It is the slow, deliberate, methodical dismantling of the post-World War II order that your grandparents built, your parents inherited, and that Washington has been sleepwalking through for the past 30 years. When the French foreign minister stands at a conference in Berlin and says, with a smile, with applause filling the room, maybe Canada at some point will join the European Union, you need to understand that these kinds of statements do not come from nowhere. In the world of high geopolitics, casual remarks from foreign ministers at international conferences are never actually casual. They are trial balloons. They are messages. They are the outer edge of conversations that have already been happening in closed rooms over long dinners across encrypted channels. France's Jean-Noël Barrot was speaking at the Europe 2026 conference in Berlin about the EU's expanding role as a so-called third superpower, a force designed to balance both Washington and Beijing. And in that context, he dropped Canada's name like a stone into still water. Watch the ripples, because those ripples tell you everything about where the world is heading. Now let's go deeper, because the surface story is almost too easy. France makes a suggestion, Canada laughs it off, everybody moves on. That is the headline version, and the headline version is almost always the least important version. What is actually happening underneath this moment is a tectonic shift in the architecture of global power that should concern every single American who cares about where their country stands in this world. Think about what has actually been unfolding over the past 12 months. Since taking office, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has signed 12 trade and security agreements across 4 continents. 12 in less than a year. That is not routine diplomacy. That is a man on a mission. That is a country that has made a decision at the highest strategic level that the old relationship with Washington is no longer sufficient, no longer safe, and no longer dependable. And when a country that shares the world's longest undefended border with you starts signing agreements across 4 continents at breakneck speed, you need to start asking yourself some very uncomfortable questions about what broke, when it broke, and who broke it. The proximate cause of all of this is the Trump administration's tariffs, its threats to abandon the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and its repeated suggestions that Canada should become the 51st American state. But here is what the analysts at Carnegie and the foreign policy thinkers in Brussels and Ottawa will tell you privately. This goes so much deeper than one administration, one president, one set of tariffs. The issue is structural. American policy now swings so dramatically between presidencies that commitments made by one administration cannot be trusted to survive the next. For allies making decade-long investments in defense procurement, energy infrastructure, or trade relationships, this volatility is intolerable. Read that again, slowly, because that is the core diagnosis, not Trump specifically, not this tariff or that threat, but the fundamental unreliability of American power as a long-term anchor. When your closest neighbor and longest ally starts describing you in those terms, you have crossed into genuinely new historical territory. Canada has now become the first non-European country to join the EU's Security Action for Europe, known as SAFE, a $170 billion defense procurement initiative designed to get Europe ready to defend itself without relying on American protection. Think about the symbolism of that for a moment. A country that has been tethered to the American defense industrial complex for generations, a country where the overwhelming majority of defense dollars flowed south toward American contractors, has now formally embedded itself into a European defense architecture that was specifically designed to operate independently of the United States. Carney announced a multi-billion-dollar defense plan that includes roughly $80 billion in direct government defense spending over 5 years, $180 billion in defense procurement, and $290 billion in defense and security-related infrastructure over the coming decade. And the man was explicit about the purpose. We've relied too heavily on our geography and others to protect us, Carney said. This has created vulnerabilities that we can no longer afford and dependencies that we can no longer sustain. When a Canadian Prime Minister says dependencies we can no longer sustain, every person in Washington should understand exactly which dependency he is talking about. Now let's talk about the Canada-EU relationship in its full dimension, because what is being built between Ottawa and Brussels right now is not just a defense partnership. It is not just a trade relationship. It is something that begins to look in its contours and its ambitions like the early stages of a much deeper integration. The European Parliament adopted a report calling on the EU to deepen ties with Canada, with members saying in an accompanying statement that Canada is perhaps the most European country outside Europe. That phrase is extraordinary. The most European country outside Europe. The European Parliament did not say that about Australia. They did not say it about Japan or South Korea. They said it about Canada. And they said it deliberately in an official report as a political signal about where they want this relationship to go. Finnish President Alexander Stubb went even further, suggesting that Canadian Prime Minister Carney consider joining the EU, framing these comments within the broader context of European leaders seeking to strengthen the bloc's geopolitical role amid the Russian war in Ukraine and American unpredictability. You need to understand what safe actually means in practical terms, because the numbers are staggering and the strategic logic is even more important than the money. SAFE mobilizes $150 billion in low-interest loans to be spent on priority categories ranging from ammunition and missiles to cyber capabilities and critical infrastructure protection. And Canada has now walked into that architecture as the only non-European member. According to the Canadian government, SAFE provides up to $244 billion in loans to EU member states to support large-scale defense projects, including critical capabilities such as ammunition, missiles, drones, artillery systems, and infantry weapons. Canadian defense companies can now bid on projects alongside European companies. Canadian manufacturers are now plugged into a European defense industrial base that is rearming at a pace not seen since the Cold War. And the explicit logic driving all of this is the recognition that American protection can no longer be taken for granted. Carney made clear that more than 70 cents of every dollar of Canadian military capital spending would no longer go to the United States. 70 cents on every dollar, redirected away from American defense contractors, away from American industrial networks, away from the deeply integrated continental defense relationship that had defined North American security for the better part of a century. Canada is also reviewing its purchase of American F-35 fighter jets, exploring other options, looking at European alternatives, looking at South Korean alternatives, looking at anything that reduces the dependency on Washington. South Korean arms manufacturers are actively positioning themselves to resupply Canada's military with everything from howitzers to submarines. This is how quickly the world is moving. A year ago, this would have been unthinkable. Today, it is simply Tuesday in Ottawa. And here is where the geopolitical picture becomes genuinely breathtaking in its scope. Carney is not just pivoting Canada toward Europe in isolation. He is building something far more ambitious. Ottawa is spearheading discussions to link the European Union with the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, creating a proposed alliance of nearly 1.5 billion people designed to counter American protectionist trade policies. Think about that architecture for a moment. The EU on one side, the Indo-Pacific trade bloc on the other, and Canada sitting in the middle as the bridge, the connector, the country that holds both ends of the string. This is not accidental. This is strategic design. Carney studied at Oxford and Harvard. He ran the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He understands global financial architecture at a level that very few politicians anywhere in the world can match. And what he has designed is a geopolitical bypass around American power, a new trading and security architecture that does not need Washington's blessing to function. Carney at Davos declared that the old order is not coming back, and that the rules-based international system was always partially false. He said the strongest countries exempted themselves when convenient, trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and Canada had been placing the sign in the window while avoiding the gaps between rhetoric and reality. That bargain, he declared, no longer works. Canada is now building what Carney called strategic autonomy, the capacity to feed itself, fuel itself, and defend itself without depending on the United States. Strategic autonomy, that is the phrase of the moment, the concept that is reshaping geopolitics from Ottawa to Berlin to Beijing. And it is a phrase that until very recently would have been considered almost heretical in Canadian political discourse. Canada was always defined by its proximity to, its integration with, its fundamental dependency on the American colossus to its south. That identity is now being systematically dismantled piece by piece, agreement by agreement, billion by billion. Now, let's be honest about the polling numbers, because they tell you something profound about where Canadian public opinion has moved in response to all of this. A survey of 4,000 Canadians found that 1 in 4 respondents thought it would be a good idea for Canada to formally join the European Union. A further 58% indicated it was a proposal worth considering further. So you have roughly 80% of Canadians who are either enthusiastically in favor of EU membership or open to exploring it. 80%. In a country that did not even have this conversation 18 months ago, Spark's chief strategy officer, Bruce Anderson, explained that what they've seen is a real shock to Canadians' sense of the status quo and whether or not it could endure. And alongside that, a real openness on the part of Canadians to find solutions to the problem of reliance on the United States. The shock that Anderson is describing is not just economic, though the tariffs have been brutal and the uncertainty has been corrosive. It is existential. Canadians looked at the American president suggesting their country should be absorbed into the United States, and they asked themselves a question that they had never had to ask before. Who are we, and where do we actually belong in this world? The answer they are arriving at is Europe. Not formally, not yet, not in the constitutional and legal sense that EU membership would require. Carney has been clear on that point. He wants deeper ties, broader partnership, but not formal membership, at least not for now. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. Canada formally became the first non-European country to join the EU's Security Action for Europe Defence Procurement Programme, with Canadian Defence Minister David McGuinty announcing the agreement during the Munich Security Conference, linking Canada to the bloc's $162 billion effort to accelerate joint defence production. That is not a trade agreement. That is not a memo of understanding. That is Canada embedding itself into the defense production architecture of a bloc that exists specifically to operate independently of the United States. The logic of that integration, once it begins, is very hard to reverse. Defense industrial partnerships create technological dependencies, create shared procurement cycles, create interoperability requirements, create the kind of structural entanglement that over decades becomes very difficult to distinguish from membership. And consider the broader ideological dimension of what is happening, because this is where the story gets truly fascinating. Carney addressed reporters and pivoted without being asked to challenge what he called Washington's desire to defend Christian nationalism, contrasting it sharply with Canada's own civic nationalism. Canadian nationalism is civic nationalism, he said, and Ottawa's mandate was to defend the rights of everyone in a vast and diverse country. He added, there is a rivalry taking place between Canadian nationalism and other forms of nationalism. A Canadian Prime Minister framing his country's relationship with the United States as a rivalry between two competing visions of what nationalism itself means. This is a remarkable statement, and it tells you that this split is not simply about tariffs and trade balances. It is about values, about identity, about what kind of country Canada wants to be, and what kind of world it wants to inhabit. And the answer that Carney and an increasing majority of Canadians are arriving at is a world that looks more like Europe than like Trump's America. Carney borrowed a framework from Finnish President Stubb called values-based realism. Canada will remain committed to sovereignty, human rights, and international law in principle. However, Canada will be pragmatic about working with partners who do not share those values. And in perhaps the most extraordinary diplomatic statement of the entire period, Carney noted in Beijing that the relationship with China was now more predictable than the one with the United States. A Canadian Prime Minister calling the Chinese Communist Party more predictable than the American government. When allies begin describing authoritarian rivals as more reliable than Washington, you are no longer in normal geopolitical territory. You have entered something genuinely new, something that the architects of the post-war order never anticipated and certainly never designed for. What all of this means for Americans is uncomfortable to confront, but essential to understand. The United States has spent 80 years building a network of alliances, partnerships, trade relationships, and security guarantees that gave American power its global reach and its extraordinary legitimacy. That network did not exist simply because other countries liked America. It existed because America was reliable, because commitments made in Washington could be counted on to survive the next election cycle, because the rules that Washington championed were rules that Washington itself broadly respected. Canada was, until recently, the test case for deep integration with the United States. More than 75% of Canadian exports went south. Supply chains, especially in automotive and energy, were seamlessly continental. And now that test case is failing. Not slowly, not ambiguously, but dramatically and publicly, and with enormous consequences for how every other American ally around the world is recalculating its own relationship with Washington. The world is not waiting for American politics to sort itself out. The world is moving. Canada is moving. Europe is moving. The global south has been moving for years. New architectures are being built. New partnerships are being forged. New defense industrial networks are being constructed that do not have Washington at their center. When France's foreign minister smiles in Berlin and says, maybe Canada at some point will join the European Union, what he is really saying is that the gravitational pull of European integration is now strong enough, and the gravitational pull of American power is now weak enough that the question is no longer absurd. And the most dangerous thing of all is that most people on this side of the border have no idea how far this has already gone, how fast it is moving, and how profoundly it is reshaping the world that American children will inherit.